The dress was powder blue, the color of a spring sky just before rain. It had cost 3 weeks of restaurant tips, purchased on layaway from a department store downtown where the saleswoman knew every girl by name and wrapped each purchase in tissue paper like it mattered. The fabric caught light differently depending on the angle, shifting from pale cerulean to something deeper, almost grey. It had a sweetheart neckline and cap sleeves, exactly what every magazine said was fashionable that season, and it hung on a padded hanger in the back of a closet for 6 weeks before the night it was meant to shine. Rebecca Hartley wore it once. She was 19 that spring, a year older than most of her classmates because she'd missed kindergarten due to pneumonia, and her mother had held her back rather than start mid-year. She worked weekends at the Bluebird Diner on Route 9, saving money for community college classes she planned to start that fall. Business administration, maybe hospitality management. She liked organizing schedules, keeping the register balanced, remembering regular customers' orders before they spoke. Her handwriting was careful and looped, the kind that filled comment cards and grocery lists with equal precision. Prom night was May 16th, 1987. A Saturday. The venue was the Elks Lodge on the edge of town, the same place that hosted wedding receptions and Rotary Club dinners, its linoleum floors waxed to a dangerous shine, and its walls decorated with crepe paper streamers in the school colors, maroon and gold. Rebecca went with a group of friends rather than a date. She'd been seeing someone casually, a guy named Travis who worked at the tire shop, but he wasn't a student anymore and couldn't buy a ticket. She said it didn't bother her. She wanted to dance with her friends anyway, take pictures, do the whole night right before everything changed. The evening started normal enough. 6 girls piled into 2 cars, drove to the venue with windows down and radio up, the kind of moment that feels unremarkable until it's the last one. Rebecca's best friend since 8th grade, a girl named Natalie Brennan, later said Rebecca seemed lighter than usual that night, excited in a way she hadn't been in months. She'd been stressed about money, about her father's health, about whether staying local was settling or being practical. But that night, she laughed at bad jokes and posed for Polaroids and told Natalie she'd made the right choice, ordering the blue dress instead of the pink one. Before we continue, if you're watching this because you remember the small moments that change everything, or because you believe no case should stay cold forever, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and do you remember where you were in 1987? Sometimes the details that seem smallest are the ones that matter most years later. The prom ended at midnight, standard curfew for a school event, enforced by chaperones who stood near the doors and checked names against a master list as students filtered out into the parking lot. It was a warm night, humid in that heavy way springs get in the valley, the kind of weather that made hairspray wilt and dress fabric cling. Most students left in groups, heading to post-prom parties at supervised houses or the bowling alley that stayed open late for the occasion. Rebecca left with Natalie and 2 other girls around 11:50 p.m. They were parked in the back row of the lot, near the tree line, where the asphalt ended and the ground turned to gravel. Natalie was driving her mother's station wagon, the same car they'd taken to the venue hours earlier. The plan, as Natalie later explained to investigators dozens of times, was to stop at the all-night diner on the highway for fries and milkshakes, then drop everyone home before 1:30. They made it as far as the parking lot exit before Rebecca asked Natalie to stop the car. She said she'd left something inside. Her shawl, maybe, or her purse. The details later became contested because nobody was paying full attention in the moment. The music was playing. Someone in the back seat was reapplying lipstick using the dome light, and the question of what Rebecca had forgotten became the kind of detail that shifts in memory each time it's revisited. What everyone agreed on was this: Rebecca opened the passenger door, stepped out onto the gravel, and said she'd be right back. She closed the door firmly, the way you do when you expect to return in 60 seconds. Natalie kept the engine running. The car idled at the parking lot exit, headlights aimed at the main road, while Rebecca's powder blue dress moved through the scattered groups of students, still lingering near their vehicles. The dress caught light from the overhead lamps that lined the lot's perimeter, making her easy to track even from a distance. Natalie watched her walk back toward the building, weaving between cars, her heels clicking on pavement. Then the dress turned left instead of heading for the main entrance. It was a small choice, a minor detour that might have meant nothing. Maybe she'd seen someone she wanted to say goodbye to. Maybe she'd changed her mind about what she'd forgotten and where she'd left it. Natalie didn't follow the movement closely because she was adjusting the radio station, and one of the backseat passengers was asking about the diner's closing time. When she looked up again 30 seconds later, she couldn't see the blue dress anymore. She assumed Rebecca had gone inside. 5 minutes passed, then 8. Natalie honked the horn twice, a friendly reminder, the kind of sound that carries across a parking lot without seeming rude. No response. One of the girls in the back seat suggested Rebecca might have run into friends, gotten caught up in conversation, lost track of time. Teenage minutes stretched differently than adult ones. At the 10-minute mark, Natalie put the car in park and went looking. The Elks Lodge was mostly empty by then. Chaperones were stacking chairs, the DJ was packing equipment, and a janitor pushed a wide broom across the dance floor. Natalie checked the bathroom first, calling Rebecca's name into the tiled echo. Empty. She walked the perimeter of the main hall, looked in the coat check area, asked 2 teachers near the exit if they'd seen a girl in a blue dress come back inside. No one had. Natalie returned to the parking lot and did a full lap on foot, checking between cars near the dumpsters along the tree line. She called Rebecca's name into the dark spaces where the overhead lights didn't quite reach. The lot was nearly empty now, just a few vehicles belonging to cleanup crew and chaperones. The car Natalie had been idling sat alone near the exit, interior light still on, engine still running. Rebecca Hartley was gone. The initial response was confusion rather than alarm. Natalie drove to the all-night diner, thinking maybe Rebecca had gotten a ride with someone else, a miscommunication, a crossed wire. No Rebecca. She tried calling Rebecca's house from a payphone outside the restaurant, letting it ring 12 times before hanging up. Then she drove to the houses of 2 other friends from their group, checking if Rebecca had somehow ended up at one of the post-prom parties. Nothing. It was 1:15 a.m. when Natalie finally drove to the Hartley house and knocked on the door. Rebecca's mother, Caroline, answered in her bathrobe, confused at first, then alarmed when Natalie explained that Rebecca had gotten out of the car at the Elks Lodge and never returned. Caroline's first instinct was to check if Rebecca had come home without telling anyone, maybe caught a ride and gone straight to bed. But Rebecca's room was empty, her bed untouched, and the dress she'd planned to change into after prom still hung on her closet door. Caroline called the police at 1:47 a.m. The dispatcher took the information calmly, noting that Rebecca was 19, an adult, and had been gone less than 2 hours from a social event. The initial assumption was typical for cases like this: a young woman leaving with friends, maybe a boyfriend, maybe deciding to extend the night without checking in. The dispatcher said an officer would file a report and follow up in the morning. Caroline insisted it wasn't like that. Rebecca was responsible. She always called if plans changed. She would never disappear without a word, especially not after promising to be home by 2. By 3 a.m., Caroline and Rebecca's father, Martin, were driving the route between the Elks Lodge and their house, headlights cutting through empty streets, looking for any sign of powder blue fabric or a figure walking alone. They found nothing. The town felt wrong at that hour, too quiet and too dark, the kind of silence that turns ordinary landmarks into question marks. The first police interview happened at 6:30 a.m., after Caroline called the station 3 more times. An officer came to the house, took notes, asked standard questions about Rebecca's habits, relationships, state of mind. Were there problems at home? Boyfriend trouble? Drugs or alcohol? Financial stress? Caroline answered each question with increasing frustration because the questions missed the point. Rebecca wasn't troubled or reckless. She was steady. She was the kind of daughter who left notes on the kitchen counter when she'd be late, who called from payphones to check in, who'd never once in 19 years caused this kind of worry. The officer took down Natalie's information and promised someone would follow up with her that morning. He suggested Rebecca might have left voluntarily, that sometimes young people make impulsive choices after big events like prom. He said most missing persons cases involving adults resolve themselves within 48 hours. But the dress bothered him. He didn't say it directly, but Caroline caught the way his pen paused when she described it. Powder blue, formal, expensive by their standards, not the kind of thing someone wears when planning to run away. The first searches started Sunday morning, organized by classmates and church members who gathered in the Elks Lodge parking lot and spread out in groups. They walked the tree line, checked drainage ditches, knocked on doors in the surrounding neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen a girl in a blue dress. The local newspaper ran a brief item on page 3. Teen missing after prom. Police investigate. Natalie was interviewed 5 times in the first 3 days. Each interview covered the same ground. What Rebecca had said, how long she'd been gone, whether anyone unusual had been at prom, if Rebecca had seemed different that night. Natalie's story stayed consistent, but the details around what Rebecca had forgotten and why she'd turned left in the parking lot remained unclear. Natalie blamed herself for not paying closer attention, for assuming Rebecca was fine when she could have been in trouble 10 seconds after stepping out of the car. The investigative theory in those first 72 hours focused on voluntary disappearance or an accidental incident. The police checked hospitals within a 50-mile radius, contacted the bus station and taxi services, interviewed Rebecca's co-workers at the diner and her supervisor at the grocery store where she'd worked the previous summer. Everyone said the same thing. Rebecca was reliable, grounded, not the type to vanish without explanation. But Travis, the casual boyfriend, complicated the narrative. He'd been at a bar the night of prom, had an alibi confirmed by 3 witnesses and a bartender who remembered him clearly. But in interviews, he admitted they'd argued 2 weeks before prom about whether their relationship was serious or just passing time. He'd wanted more. She'd wanted space to figure out her future. He said it ended fine, no hard feelings, but the police noted the tension anyway. Relationship friction, unresolved feelings, potential motive if things had escalated. Travis was questioned extensively and took a voluntary polygraph. He passed. His timeline for the night was airtight, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to the disappearance. But in a small town, suspicion doesn't require evidence. People whispered, they wondered. They noted that Travis had a temper sometimes, that he'd been seen arguing with Rebecca outside the diner in April, that maybe the breakup hadn't been as clean as he claimed. The dress became the case's symbolic anchor almost immediately. Local news stations ran segments showing Caroline holding it up against the light, describing how Rebecca had looked in it, how excited she'd been to wear it. The image of the empty dress, still on its hanger, still smelling faintly of the perfume Rebecca had worn that night, became shorthand for everything the family had lost. It appeared in vigil posters and search flyers, always with the same plea. Have you seen Rebecca Hartley? Weeks passed without meaningful progress. The investigation expanded, then contracted. Police interviewed over 60 people connected to the prom: students, chaperones, venue staff, parents who'd dropped off or picked up their children. No one reported seeing Rebecca after she walked away from Natalie's car. The Elks Lodge parking lot had no surveillance cameras. The building's interior camera system had malfunctioned weeks earlier and hadn't been repaired. The nearest traffic camera was 3 miles away on the highway. One early theory suggested Rebecca had been picked up by someone she knew, possibly meeting them intentionally. This would explain why she'd asked Natalie to stop, why she'd walked toward a different part of the lot instead of the entrance. But Rebecca's close friends insisted she hadn't mentioned plans to meet anyone, and her family couldn't identify anyone she'd have reason to see at that hour. A second theory emerged from witness statements about a dark-colored sedan that had been parked near the tree line during prom. 2 students mentioned it independently: an older car, possibly a late 70s model, parked away from other vehicles. It was gone by the time police checked the lot Sunday morning, and no one had noted the license plate or make. The lead went nowhere, though it seeded persistent rumors about stranger abduction. By July, the case file was thick but directionless. The FBI had been consulted and declined formal involvement. There was no evidence of kidnapping across state lines or organized crime. Rebecca's bank account showed no activity. Her social security number hadn't been used. She had no driver's license, no car, no credit cards. She existed in paperwork as a missing person, a statistical category, a file that got thinner each month as leads dried up and new cases demanded attention. The Hartley family hired a private investigator in August, a former police detective named Boone, who specialized in cold cases. He spent 6 weeks reviewing everything, re-interviewing witnesses, checking angles the police might have missed. His conclusion was frustratingly vague. Something had happened in that parking lot between the time Rebecca left Natalie's car and the time her presence was no longer detectable. Either she'd gotten into a vehicle voluntarily, or she'd been taken by force in the narrow window when no one was watching. Without physical evidence or additional witnesses, the case couldn't move forward. The town's attention eventually shifted. Search parties stopped organizing, news coverage dwindled. The flyers on telephone poles faded in the sun and were covered by newer announcements. Rebecca's story became local legend, the kind of thing people mentioned when warning their own daughters about staying in groups, about checking in, about not trusting that everything's fine just because it seems fine. Caroline kept Rebecca's room exactly as it had been. The powder blue dress hung in the closet, protected by a clear garment bag. Every year on May 16th, the family held a small memorial at the high school, fewer people attending each time. By the 5th anniversary, it was mostly family and Natalie, who'd moved 2 hours away for college but always came back for that day. Time moved in strange ways after trauma. Weeks felt like months, then years collapsed into moments. Rebecca's younger brother graduated high school, started a family, named his daughter Rebecca Caroline. Martin Hartley died of a heart attack in 1995, and Caroline told people at the funeral that he'd never recovered from losing their daughter, that grief had slowly dismantled him from the inside. The case officially went cold in 1992, transferred to a storage facility where boxes of evidence and witness statements sat alongside hundreds of other unsolved files. Occasionally, a new detective would review it, looking for something previous investigators had missed, but the conclusion was always the same. Without new evidence, without a body, without a credible witness coming forward, there was nothing to pursue. Travis moved out of state in 1993, tired of the sideways glances and whispered suspicions. Natalie became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping families navigate systems that often failed them. She never talked about prom night publicly, but friends said it haunted her, that she'd replay those final minutes in the parking lot thousands of times, wondering if a different choice would have changed everything. The dress remained in Caroline's closet for 36 years, untouched except for the times she'd take it out and hold it against the light, trying to remember her daughter's face the night she'd worn it. The break came in April 2023, not through investigation or confession, but through demolition. The Elks Lodge had closed permanently in 2019, unable to compete with newer venues and struggling with deferred maintenance. The building sat empty for 4 years, windows boarded, parking lot cracked and overgrown, a relic from a time when community organizations could afford their own spaces. In early 2023, a developer purchased the property with plans to tear down the structure and build a small medical complex. The demolition crew started work on April 3rd. They cleared the interior first, removing old furniture and fixtures, checking for hazardous materials, systematically stripping the building down to its bones. On April 11th, workers were removing panels from a storage area behind the main hall when they found a sealed crawl space beneath the stage. It wasn't on any blueprints they'd been given. The access panel had been concealed behind a built-in cabinet that had probably been installed decades after the building's original construction. The space was small, maybe 4 feet high and 8 feet deep, with a dirt floor and cinder block walls. Workers opened it expecting to find old equipment or forgotten storage. Instead, they found a blue dress. It was folded carefully, placed in a plastic storage bin that had protected it from moisture and pests. The powder blue fabric was faded but intact, still recognizable as formal wear despite the years. Next to the bin was a small cardboard box containing a pair of women's dress shoes, a silver necklace with a broken clasp, and a high school class ring. And inside the dress, pinned to the interior lining with a safety pin, was a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook. The words were written in pencil, letters pressed deep into the page as if the writer had been shaking. Not alone. The construction foreman called the police immediately. He'd lived in town long enough to remember the Hartley case, long enough to recognize that a blue formal dress hidden beneath the Elks Lodge stage wasn't a coincidence. The investigation reopened within hours. The items were transported to the county forensics lab, where technicians documented every detail. The bin's manufacturer and date of production, the dress's fabric and construction, the age of the paper and pencil markings. The class ring bore initials R.H. The necklace matched a description from Caroline's original missing persons report, a gift Rebecca had received for her 18th birthday. DNA was extracted from hair fibers found on the dress fabric and compared against DNA samples Caroline had preserved, hoping for this exact possibility. The match was confirmed within 2 weeks. The dress had belonged to Rebecca Hartley. But Rebecca herself wasn't in the crawl space. There were no human remains, no evidence of violence, no indication that the space had been used for anything other than concealing these items. The dress had been placed there deliberately, carefully folded, preserved as if someone had intended it to be found eventually, but not immediately. The note changed everything. Not alone implied Rebecca had written it, that she'd been aware of her situation, that she'd tried to leave a message, but the context was missing. Not alone where? When? Under what circumstances? Forensic analysis of the note revealed it had been written with a standard Number 2 pencil on notebook paper, common to any drugstore in 1987. The handwriting was compared against samples of Rebecca's writing from school papers and work schedules. The comparison was complicated by the note's obvious stress indicators, the shaky pressure and irregular spacing, but 2 handwriting experts agreed it was likely Rebecca's writing. The investigators focused on reconstructing the timeline with this new information. The dress had been removed from Rebecca at some point after she left Natalie's car, but before her disappearance became permanent. Someone had taken the time to fold it, box it with her jewelry and shoes, and hide it in a location that was both accessible from the Elks Lodge and completely concealed from casual view. The crawlspace access required knowledge of the building's layout. Workers who'd been on staff in 1987 were tracked down and interviewed. Most were elderly now, some had died, but enough remained to confirm that the storage area behind the stage had always been cluttered with old decorations and sound equipment. The cabinet concealing the crawlspace had been installed sometime in the early 1980s by a volunteer crew during renovations. Anyone who'd helped with those renovations or worked events regularly would have known about the space. This narrowed the suspect pool significantly. Police compiled a list of 23 people who'd had regular access to the building in 1987. Staff members, frequent volunteers, maintenance contractors, and members of organizations that used the space monthly. Cross-referencing this list with people who'd been present the night of prom yielded 4 names. One of those names was Raymond Price. He'd been 51 in 1987, worked as a part-time custodian and maintenance person for the Elks Lodge for over a decade. He'd been at the building prom night, responsible for set-up and clean-up, present when students arrived, and still there when they left. He'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation and cleared because his responsibilities kept him visible and busy all evening. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing him throughout the night, emptying trash, adjusting thermostats, fixing a broken table leg. But the interview notes from 1987 hadn't asked about after the event ended. They hadn't mapped his movements during cleanup, when the crowd thinned and chaperones were distracted with final tasks. Raymond Price had died in 2009, 14 years before the dress was found, but his widow, Marianne, was still living in the same house they'd shared for 43 years. Detectives knocked on her door on May 2, 2023, carrying photographs of the items found in the crawlspace and copies of Raymond's original witness statement. Marianne was 78, sharp but wary, the kind of wariness that comes from years of protecting something. The conversation started carefully. Police explained about the demolition, the discovery, the reopened investigation. They asked if Marianne remembered her husband's work schedule around prom season in 1987. She did. He'd worked most school events, needed the extra money, was reliable about showing up even when the hours were inconvenient. Then they asked about the crawl space, whether Raymond had ever mentioned it, whether he'd stored personal items in the building, whether he'd acted differently in the days following May 16, 1987, Marianne's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like resignation. She asked if she needed a lawyer. The detective said she wasn't under arrest, wasn't being accused of anything, but she had the right to legal counsel if she wanted it. She said she'd been waiting for this conversation for 36 years, that she'd known eventually someone would ask the right questions. Then she told them what she knew. Raymond had come home at 3 a.m. the night of prom, hours later than expected. He'd been shaking, wouldn't make eye contact, said there'd been an incident at the lodge, but it was handled. Marianne had pressed for details, worried he'd been hurt or witnessed something terrible. He'd refused to explain, just repeated that it was handled, and she shouldn't ask again. Over the next week, Raymond had been different. Withdrawn, sleeping poorly, jumping at unexpected sounds. Marianne had convinced herself it was stress from overwork, from money problems, from the ordinary pressures of a difficult season. Then she'd found the clothes. They were in the garage, stuffed in a trash bag at the bottom of a bin he used for yard waste. A pair of men's work pants and a shirt, both stained with what looked like blood. Not a lot, not like something from a violent attack, but enough to notice. She'd confronted him, and he'd told her he'd helped someone who'd fallen in the parking lot, scraped her knee badly, and he'd gotten blood on himself trying to assist her. He said he'd thrown the clothes away because the stains wouldn't come out, and he didn't want her worrying about it. The explanation had been plausible enough that Marianne accepted it, or told herself she accepted it. But it sat wrong with her, the way things do when you're choosing not to look too closely. She'd noticed other small changes. Raymond avoided reading the newspaper for weeks after the girl's disappearance made headlines. He'd been unusually interested in the investigation's progress, asking Marianne if she'd heard any updates, whether the police had found anything. By the time the case went cold, Raymond had returned to something approximating normal. The incident, whatever it was, had been buried beneath routine and time. Marianne had convinced herself that her husband's strange behavior had been coincidental, that the girl's disappearance was unrelated to his difficult night. But she'd never quite believed it. The detectives asked if she'd kept the stained clothes. She hadn't. They'd been thrown away 36 years ago, collected with regular trash, gone. They asked if Raymond had ever confessed, directly or indirectly, to involvement in Rebecca's disappearance. Marianne said no, not explicitly, but sometimes late at night in the years before he died, he'd mention the girl who went missing after prom, would talk about how unfair it was that her family never got closure. He'd say things like, "Some accidents can't be fixed," or "Sometimes helping makes things worse." It was never quite a confession, never quite an exoneration. The detective spent the next month building a reconstruction based on Marianne's testimony, the physical evidence, and the timeline. The theory that emerged fit the available facts better than any previous hypothesis. Rebecca had left Natalie's car, intending to retrieve something from inside the building. Instead of going through the main entrance, she'd walked around to the side door that staff used, possibly because it was closer, or because she'd seen a custodian there and planned to ask for help. Raymond had been near that entrance, doing final cleanup tasks alone. What happened next was never entirely clear, but the evidence suggested an accidental death rather than premeditated violence. Rebecca may have fallen downstairs leading to the storage area, may have been startled and struck her head, may have collapsed from a sudden medical event. Raymond, finding her unresponsive, had panicked. Instead of calling for help immediately, he'd made a choice that defined the next 36 years. He'd hidden the body, removed evidence, concealed what had happened because he was afraid he'd be blamed for something he didn't do or couldn't explain. The blood on his clothes suggested he'd moved her, tried to help her, or staged something to look like she'd never been there. But Rebecca's body wasn't in the crawl space. This remained the case's central mystery even after the dress's discovery. Investigators conducted ground-penetrating radar scans around the former Elks Lodge property, checked drainage systems and nearby undeveloped land. Nothing. The prevailing theory, supported by analysis of Raymond's behavior patterns and the timing of his movements in subsequent weeks, was that he'd temporarily hidden Rebecca's body in the crawl space immediately after she died, then moved it later to a more permanent location when he could do so without suspicion. The dress and jewelry had been left behind, either forgotten in his panic or deliberately separated from the body as a form of psychological distance. The "not alone" note suggested Rebecca had been conscious at some point after leaving Natalie's car, had found something to write with, had tried to leave evidence. The note's placement inside the dress indicated it had been on her person when Raymond found her. Whether she'd written it before or after whatever accident occurred, whether it referred to Raymond's presence or to a hope that someone would find her, remained ambiguous. In September 2023, the district attorney held a press conference announcing the findings. The investigation concluded that Rebecca Hartley had died on or shortly after May 16, 1987, most likely from accidental causes during an interaction with Raymond Price, who had subsequently concealed the death and disposed of evidence. Because Price was deceased, no criminal charges could be filed. The case was classified as solved but unprosecutable. Caroline Hartley, 83 years old and in declining health, attended the press conference. She'd waited 36 years for answers. When reporters asked how she felt about the resolution, she said it was both a relief and a new kind of grief. Knowing that Rebecca had died accidentally, possibly while just trying to get back to her friends, made the loss feel even more senseless. But the dress's discovery had given her something she hadn't had before: certainty. Rebecca hadn't run away. She hadn't been reckless or foolish. She'd been 19 years old, wearing a powder blue dress she'd saved up to buy, walking back toward a building where help should have been available, and something went wrong in the worst possible way. The dress itself was returned to Caroline after the investigation concluded. She placed it back in the closet where it had hung for over 3 decades, next to the space where it had been missing, as if restoring the physical object could somehow restore the time it represented. Rebecca's remains were never found. Investigators continued searching for several months, expanding their focus based on properties Raymond Price had access to in 1987, but the landscape had changed too much. New construction, natural erosion, 36 years of transformation made recovery unlikely. The case was added to the national database of resolved missing persons, a closure that couldn't truly close because one essential piece remained absent. The family held a memorial service in November 2023, finally able to say with certainty that Rebecca had died the night she disappeared, that her absence had been involuntary, that she'd tried to leave evidence even when circumstances were beyond her control. Natalie attended the service, the first time she'd returned to town in years. She told Caroline that knowing the truth hadn't removed her guilt, but it had reshaped it into something more bearable. She'd spent decades wondering if she'd failed to notice something obvious, if her inattention had cost her best friend everything. Learning that Rebecca had walked into a situation no one could have predicted from the parking lot didn't absolve the guilt completely, but it made it less absolute. Travis, the ex-boyfriend who'd lived under suspicion for years despite his alibi, sent a statement to the press conference, but didn't attend. He said he hoped the revelation would allow people to remember Rebecca as a person rather than a mystery, to stop treating her disappearance as entertainment or speculation. The powder blue dress remained the case's most powerful symbol, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it represented. Evidence that survived even when memory faded, proof that Rebecca had existed and mattered beyond the moment she vanished. The dress had been hidden for 36 years, in a space that should have been discovered during any thorough search of the building. That it took complete demolition to reveal it felt like a metaphor for how easily truth can be concealed by the ordinary, by the spaces no one thinks to check. In the end, the case offered a strange kind of closure: answers without completeness, truth without recovery, justice acknowledged but undeliverable. Raymond Price had taken most of the specifics with him when he died in 2009, leaving only fragments and implications for investigators to piece together. What happened in those minutes between when Rebecca left Natalie's car and when she stopped existing as anything other than absence would never be fully reconstructed. But the note remained, those 2 words written in a moment of fear or hope or both. Not alone. Whether Rebecca had meant she wasn't alone in the crawl space, that she needed others to search for her, or that she held on to hope someone would find what she'd left behind, the message had finally reached the people who needed to hear it. 36 years late, but heard nonetheless. The Elks Lodge site is now a medical complex, built on ground that held secrets for decades before surrendering them to demolition and chance. There's no marker indicating what was found there, no plaque explaining the building's final contribution to a family's long wait for truth. Most people who use the facility don't know its history, don't connect the address to a story that defined a town's understanding of how quickly everything can change. Caroline keeps the dress in a cedar chest now, protected from light and time, alongside the jewelry and shoes that were returned to her after forensic processing. Sometimes when the May 16th anniversary approaches, she takes them out and arranges them carefully on her bed, reconstructing the outfit Rebecca wore the last night she was whole and happy, and convinced the future was something she could plan for. The rest of the year, the chest stays closed. The past doesn't need to be constantly revisited to remain real. It's enough to know the truth exists, even when the truth can't bring back what was lost or undo the decades of not knowing. Rebecca Hartley died at 19, wearing a powder blue dress that cost 3 weeks of tips, in a building where she should have been safe, during a night that should have been ordinary. That's what happened. That's what the dress and the note and 36 years of investigation finally revealed. What remained unresolved, what the closure couldn't quite touch, was simpler and harder, where Raymond Price had taken her after, and whether that location would ever yield the final piece of evidence that would let Rebecca be more than memory. For now, the dress speaks for what can't be spoken, and sometimes that has to be enough.